came about. So anyway, but thank you for joining me. So we are going to, this presentation will take us up through the 21st century of what's going on, what's happened in Leesburg. So to begin with, here we go. Early history of this area, of course, native inhabitants were in this area before white settlement, and those included members of the Algonquian and Siouan nations. In 1699, we have the first recorded encounter between native peoples and whites in this area. Two plantation owners from what is now Stafford County, Burr Harrison and Giles Vandercastle, were sent up here by the colonial governors on a reconnaissance mission, and Harrison recorded in his diary an encounter that they had with members of the Piscataway tribe of the Algonquian Nation. This is a modern painting by William Woodward that imagines what that encounter might have looked like. The Piscataways were originally in what is now Maryland and had been pushed south by white settlement. By 1722, enough whites had moved into this area that the native peoples were being pushed even further west. And Virginia Governor Alexander Spotswood, along with the governors of New York and Pennsylvania, signed a treaty with the Five Nations of the Iroquois, known as the Great Treaty of 1722. And in that treaty, the Iroquois ceded or relinquished their claim to all of the lands west of the Blue Ridge to the colony of Virginia. Of course, by this time, their numbers had been greatly decimated by smallpox. So I'm going to go back in time a little bit and talk about the Northern Neck Proprietary. Because this whole area was part of a land grant made by Charles II. So in 1649, Charles II granted a tract of land known as the Northern Neck Proprietary to a group of English noblemen. Now, Charles was not, in fact, King of England at the time. He was in exile on the continent, his father having been beheaded by Cromwell. And this was a political move on his part to get these English noblemen to support his bid to regain the throne. So in the grant, the proprietary was described as all of the land between the heads or head springs and waters of the Potomac and Rappahannock rivers. So these English noblemen did in fact support Charles' bid to regain the throne, which he did. He was restored to the throne in 1660, and at that point, the grant was legally recognized. Now, for the most part, these English noblemen were not terribly interested in a piece of unsurveyed land in the backwoods of Virginia, except for one, and that was one of the grantees was a man named Thomas Culpeper. He and his brother were two of the original grantees. There were 6 shares of the proprietary, and after the grant was legally recognized, Thomas Culpeper acquired 4 of the remaining 4 of the shares that he and his brother didn't own. And so the Culpeper family ended up owning the entire proprietary. And in 1719, Thomas's grandson, Thomas Fairfax, the 6th Lord Fairfax of Cameron, inherited all 6 shares. So he inherited 5 shares from his grandfather, Thomas Culpeper, and his mother, who was Margaret Culpeper, Thomas's daughter, had actually inherited the last share from a cousin, and then he inherited it in 1719 upon her death. So in the early 1730s, however, the colony of Virginia made a legal challenge of Lord Fairfax's ownership of, as well as the boundaries, in particular the southern boundary of the proprietary. Fairfax actually traveled to Virginia, spent a couple of years here, and the main purpose of his visit was to begin the process of surveying that southern boundary. He spent about 2 years here, he returned to England, and it took another 10 years before the Privy Council of London decided finally in his favor that he in fact did own the Northern Neck Proprietary in its entirety, and they determined its southern boundary. And the recognized boundaries included 5.2 million acres of land. And this map shows the proprietary with the modern counties in Virginia and West Virginia. So what they determined the southern boundary to be was the Rappahannock River to its confluence with the Rapidan River, to its confluence with the Conway River, to its head spring. And then to determine the western boundary, they basically drew a line from the head springs of the North Branch of the Potomac River to the head spring of the Conway River. And that's this line right here. It's known as the Fairfax Line, and it still exists today. In fact, forms the boundaries between a number of counties in both in Virginia and West Virginia. So now today, when we talk about the Northern Neck, what we're talking about is just this peninsula between the Potomac and Rappahannock rivers up to about Fredericksburg. But in fact, the Northern Neck was all of this land up into what is now West Virginia. All right, so back to Leesburg. Now, from the beginning, both the Culpepers and the Fairfaxes saw the Northern Neck Proprietary as a source of income. I mean, that's the whole point of getting a grant from the king, was not to build a summer home. It was to increase your wealth. And so they established plantations here. They leased land. They sold parcels. They hired a series of land managers here who then sent money back to England for them. So this map, this is a 1757 map of Loudoun County. Lord Fairfax sold off about 4,000 acres in what is now Leesburg. Today, Leesburg encompasses a little over 8,000 acres. So about half of what became of what is Leesburg now, Fairfax sold off. The property changed hands a bunch of times, a number of times over the years, but the owners, for the most part, leased out the land. And by the 1750s, a settlement had grown up at the crossroads of two very important trade routes. And these trade routes actually date back to the native peoples who used these to go both north and south and east and west. And so the North-South Carolina Road is intersected by the east-west Alexandria or Shenandoah Road, depending upon which direction you're traveling. Of course, these two routes are still in use today. Right? And I drove on one of them on my way in here. Anybody want to say what they are today?
7 Route 15.
That's right, Route 7 and Route 15. So, so in 1757, Loudoun County was established by the Virginia House of Burgesses. So by 1757, enough whites had settled in this area that there was the need to establish another county. It was divided out of what was Fairfax County, originally was part of Fairfax County, was divided out. And there was a need at this point to have a new courthouse so that people didn't have to travel quite so far to conduct legal business. And so one of the people who lived in this little settlement at the crossroads was a man named Nicholas Minor. He owned a tavern here. And so he'd been leasing land. He purchased 326 acres from John Carlisle, who then owned it, and had 60 of those acres subdivided by a surveyor into 70 lots. And then this is the original plan of Leesburg. He named his new town Georgetown in honor of the then reigning monarch of England, King George II. And he offered it up to the House of Burgesses as the new county seat. And so they took him up on his offer. In 1758, the town was indeed selected as the location for the newly created Loudoun County Courthouse, but it was renamed Leesburg in honor of the Lee family. The patriarch of the Lee family, Thomas Lee, had died in 1750, but two of his sons, Richard Henry Lee and Francis Lightfoot Lee, along with Nicholas Minor, were named as trustees of the new town. So here's a trivia question for you. What else are Richard Henry Lee and Francis Lightfoot Lee famous for? They signed the Declaration of the Independence, and they're the only brothers to have signed the Declaration of Independence. Thank you. So this is a bit close-up of that plan of Leesburg. You can see here that there was a lot reserved for the courthouse there. So Wirt Street was originally known as Back Street, but King and Loudon and Market and Royal and Cornwall, those street names have remained. So when Nicholas Minor sold off the lots, he had these 70 lots. And when he sold them off in the new town, he required that the property owners build a brick, stone, or wood house at least 20 feet by 16 feet by 9 feet high within 3 years of acquiring the property. These were covenants in the deeds. And if they didn't comply with these covenants, then the property would indeed revert to Minor. And we have several of these so-called covenant houses that are still recognizable today in close to their original appearance. There are other ones that exist, but for the most part, they've been built onto, and so you can't really see them as the covenant house that they are. But so the first one is the stone house on Loudon Street, next to the North House. And then, of course, the Donaldson cabin, which is owned by the town, next to the Loudon Museum and the parking garage. The Birkby House, the original portion of the Birkby House was a covenant house. And so if you walk around, the Birkby House faces Loudon Street, but if you walk around onto Liberty Street and look at the facade at that side, the right-hand side of it, you can see is a much smaller original portion of it was originally a covenant house. So during the Revolutionary War, during the colonial era, the Church of England was the official state church, right? It collected tithes or taxes from all citizens, regardless of whether or not they were members of the church. And any dissenter church had to get permission from the crown through the colonial governor to operate, to hold services. And Leesburg and Loudoun County had substantial numbers of dissenters, including Quakers, Methodists, Lutherans, Baptists, and Presbyterians. In 1766, Nicholas Minor sold a lot in Leesburg to Robert Hamilton, a trustee of the Methodist Church, for no other use but for a church or meeting house and graveyard. And this made Leesburg home to the earliest known property in the United States owned by the Methodist Church. And this is a photo of the old stone church that existed on that site. The old stone church is long gone, but the cemetery still exists today and is still owned by the Methodist Church and is considered a shrine of the Methodist Church today. So by the beginning of the American Revolution, Leesburg had grown to about 500 residents. And in 1774, a group of Loudoun property owners met at the courthouse, and they adopted the Loudoun County Resolves, which was a statement regarding the taxation issues that they were facing. And it was a precursor to the Declaration of Independence, and a lot of other places adopted these similar resolves. And they sent a delegation to the Virginia meeting on the issue of taxation. And during the war, every free man in Loudoun, ages 16 to 50, enrolled in the county militia. And by 1781, Loudoun had the largest militia in Virginia at about almost 1,800 men. So after the Revolutionary War, so these are just some snippets of things that happened during the early days of Leesburg. The Volunteer Fire Company was formed in 1803. They still exist today. In 1811, a new courthouse was constructed, replacing the original one built in 1761. And of course, in 1895, a third courthouse was built, replacing this one. That's the one that exists today. In February 1813, the town of Leesburg was incorporated by the Virginia General Assembly. We were chartered in 1758, but we were incorporated in 1813. The new government consisted of a mayor, a recorder, and a council, all who were elected annually. Can you imagine having annual elections? Be constantly in re-election mode. A man named John Rose was elected the first mayor of Leesburg. As I said earlier, prior to that, the town was governed by a board of trustees who were appointed by the General Assembly. During the War of 1812, in August 1814, the British invaded Washington, D.C. and set fire to a number of buildings, including the presidential mansion. It was not known as the White House at that time, and the Capitol building. The Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and other important documents from the federal archives, including most of George Washington's papers, were loaded into wagons and brought out to Leesburg, where they were stored in an empty house on Work Street. There are competing stories about this. Maryland claims that they all went to Maryland. There is also a story that they went to Rokeby, which is a house south of Leesburg that had a vault in the cellar. But this is our story, and we're sticking to it.
Do we know which one?
No, not specifically. In 1814, the town limits were expanded to include an additional 105 acres. In 1817, the town organized a lottery to raise $3,000 for the paving of the streets. I'm not sure what the prize was, but what did you get if you won the lottery? In 1820, Leesburg Turnpike opened, connecting Leesburg with Georgetown, with Washington, D.C., and the Little River Turnpike system. And by 1830, the turnpike was extended westward, connecting Leesburg to the Shenandoah Valley. In 1821, the first municipal water system was installed here in Leesburg. Wooden pipes carried water from a spring, what at that time was west of town, of course, is now within town. And in 2008, a section of this original pipe was discovered on the Rock Spring Farm property. And here it is. It's on display in the utilities department if anybody wants to go see it, at the intersection of Loudon Street and Dry Mill Road. So one of the biggest events in Leesburg during the 19th century was the farewell tour of the Marquee de Lafayette. The Marquee de Lafayette was the last surviving French general of the American Revolution. He was the hero of the siege of Yorktown, and he came at the behest of President James Monroe to make a tour of the then 24 states of the United States. He was here for the election in November of 1824 when John Quincy Adams was elected. He was here for then the inauguration of John Quincy Adams. And in August of 1825, James Monroe at that time had retired to Oak Hill, his home just south of Leesburg, which still exists today. It's privately owned. So a painting of it. At that time, then they held a banquet in his honor here in Leesburg, and President John Quincy Adams attended it, and an estimated 8,000 to 10,000 people attended the celebrations on the Loudoun County Courthouse lawn. So by the 1850 census, Leesburg had grown to about 17,000 residents. I'm sorry, 1,700. Did I say 17,000? 1,700 residents. This is a copy of the 1853 Yardley Taylor map. I'll show you a larger version of it in just a second. You can see how much things had grown by then. In the 1860 presidential election, the Constitutional Union candidate, John Bell, received 60% of the votes in Loudoun County. The 1860 presidential election was essentially two separate elections, one in the north and one in the south, because they had different candidates. And in 1861, Loudoun County sent delegates to the Virginia Secession Convention. Leesburg Attorney John Janney and John Armistead Carter both voted against secession. But the ordinance of secession was adopted by the convention, and Virginia eventually seceded. In May 1861, Leesburg men, of course, only men could vote then, overwhelmingly ratified the ordinance in support of secession. So here is that larger version of the map. You can see things have started to expand out. You can see the Methodist Meeting House up here, the Presbyterian Church, the Methodist Episcopal Church South. By that point, the Methodist Church had divided into two sects. It was not until the early 20th century that they actually came back together. So you can see where how the town is growing. You can see the cemetery up there, which is the Union Cemetery, was established in the early 1850s. So during the Civil War, many Leesburg men did enlist, mostly either in the 8th Virginia Infantry or the 6th Virginia Cavalry. Quakers and Germans in the Lovettsville and Waterford areas formed Loudoun's only Union unit, known as the Loudoun Rangers. And in May of 1861, the Leesburg Town Council started printing its own paper currency known as dog money, because it had a picture of the mayor's dog on it. And almost $100,000 of this was printed. Of course, technically it was not legal. So, the Battle of Ball's Bluff. This is the only significant battle of the Confederacy, of the Civil War that took place here in the Leesburg area. Throughout the fall of 1861, Leesburg was occupied by the Confederacy under the command of Colonel Nathan Shanks Evans. And on the morning of October 21st, 1861, based on a faulty intelligence report, right, the Union sent a raiding party across the river from Harrison Island. So the Union troops were occupying Harrison Island. They sent a raiding party across to where Ball's Bluff is to attack a camp, a Confederate camp that actually did not exist. A scout had been out, thought they saw tents, they didn't. And so this raiding party came across the river. So here's a map of that. This is Potomac River with Harrison Island and then Ball's Bluff. Instead, what the raiding party encountered was a company of Mississippi infantrymen, and fighting ensued. Union Colonel Edward Baker, who was also a sitting senator from Illinois, ordered as many troops as possible, as available, to cross the river in support of the raiding party. Unfortunately, Colonel Baker was not much on logistics, and not enough boats were available to transport troops across the river, and a bottleneck developed. And so by the late afternoon, the Union began to retreat, with the Confederates holding the high ground of the bluff at Ball's Bluff, looking over the river. So it was a Union defeat. So the impact, it was a relatively small battle, and it was not a planned battle. It was more of a mistake, but it had a really outsized impact. So all told, 1,700 Union troops crossed the river. 223 died, including 166 who drowned in the river trying to get back across to Harrison Island. 226 were wounded, 553 were captured, including, well, of the dead, included Senator Baker, who was a personal friend of President Lincoln's. And did I say Illinois? He was a senator from Indiana. Oregon. Wow. Okay. Okay. Thank you. So the Confederates engaged almost as many troops in the battle, but had far fewer casualties. But the battle had major impacts. First of all, the bodies of the Union dead who drowned in the river floated downriver to Washington, D.C., and horrified people living in D.C., and led to public outcries about the conduct of the war. There were reports of the savagery of the Confederate troops because they fired on the Union soldiers as they were retreating, which was really, not good conduct of the war, right? They're trying to retreat. Death of a sitting senator, as I mentioned. It was also the third consecutive Union defeat after Bull Run and Wilson's Creek in Missouri. And so it directly led to the establishment of the Congressional Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War. So it had a big impact on the war, despite being a relatively small battle. During the winter of 1861 and 1862, 3 forts were built on the hills surrounding Leesburg by the Confederate Army: Fort Johnston, Fort Evans, and Fort Beauregard. So this is the plan of Fort Evans, and It actually still exists today. It's obviously buried. This is an aerial photo, Battlefield Parkway, Edwards Ferry. This is the outlet mall right here. And so right there in the center, that is the site of Fort Evans. And you can still see the tree line that outlines the battlements of the fort. Fort Johnston also, the foundation of it still exists. It's privately owned. Fort Beauregard's gone completely. It's now part of Beauregard Estates subdivision. In March of 1862 was the first time that the Union troops occupied Leesburg. George Fox, who was the clerk of the court, evacuated the county's records down to Lynchburg, which is why they survived. And we're actually pretty unique in Virginia that we have almost complete records dating back to the establishment of the county. In September of 1862, the Confederates recaptured Leesburg. General Robert E. Lee took up residence at Harrison Hall on North King Street. It's also known as, today it's known as the Glenfiddich House. And there he met with Generals Jackson, Stuart, and Longstreet to plan their advance across the Potomac in what became the Antietam Campaign. In June of 1864, General Jubal Early and his troops passed right through downtown Leesburg after an aborted attack on Washington, chased by Union troops. And by the end of the war, Leesburg had changed hands 150 times, estimated 150 times between the Union and the Confederacy. So following the Civil War, like the rest of Leesburg, rest of Virginia, Leesburg was indeed battered and broke. I showed this presentation to my mother at one point, and she said, "Don't you mean broken?" The grammarian that she is. And I said, "Not broken, broke. We didn't have any money." So, but our industries, generally being, milling and transport, warehousing, supported the agrarian economy of the surrounding county. And our proximity to Washington as a market, as a destination for those agricultural goods, helped our recovery. Rail service to and from Alexandria, which had reached Leesburg in 1860, but had been suspended during the war, was resumed in 1867. However, by 1900, the rail line had only extended to Bluemont to the west, and it never actually went across the mountain. So that's a photo of the train station. By the 1870 train, what?
Train station?
So that's it's gone.
Oh. Is that Leesburg?
Yeah, that was the passenger station in Leesburg. But
was it located down in Dry Mill area or further into Harrison?
it was like at Harrison, where the W&OD Trail, which was the railroad, Harrison Street in that area. So there's a little row of condos right there.
Right.
That's where that was. By the 1870 census, the population had dropped to just under 1,200. And then this is the 1878 Gray's new map of Leesburg. So you can see it had grown quite a bit. These blue areas here, those are churches or cemeteries. And you can see or the courthouse. So the courthouse is there, the Episcopal Church. So, and you can see that Fayette Street is now, so what was Market is now Edwards Ferry, and Fayette Street became Market. So, economic recovery. So Carlheim, a large Victorian mansion, was built for Pennsylvania industrialist Charles Paxton and his wife Rachel in the early 1870s. It is a rare example of Victorian Italianate architecture in this area. When they had one daughter who died, and when Rachel died, she left the house and her estate, creating a trust, and this became the Paxton Home, convalescent home, and then it was a convalescent home for children. And then, as of course, as healthcare improved, and we didn't need convalescent homes so much, it became an orphanage, and it was a daycare And today it's the home of the Ark of Loudon. I don't know if you've seen in the news, there's some angst about whether or not their lease is going to be renewed. For a long time, they used this house as the Shocktober haunted house. Unfortunately, the house is in very bad shape. And so the fire marshal won't let them do that anymore. And so hoping that somehow this house gets saved because it's not in good shape. In 1880, the first telephone was installed in Leesburg. And in 1887, the town council engaged the Norris brothers, who were a local construction company, to build a building at the corner of Loudon and King Streets. This picture of it, this two-story building, it cost $15,000 to build, contained the town offices, retail shops, and a 450-seat theater on the second floor. The Opera House was demolished in 1956. And the building that now houses the Senor Ramon Taqueria there at the corner is what is there now. In 1891, electricity was installed, but the first electric line only ran from West Market to Cornwall. So not very far. And in 1895, the third and present Loudoun County Courthouse was completed, also built by the Norris brothers. The Norris brothers are largely responsible for a lot of the institutional buildings and larger homes that were constructed in the late 1800s. Early 20th century. So Leesburg remained the center of commerce for Loudoun County, which was largely agricultural at the time. Agriculture evolved during this time. The beef and dairy industries grew up. Corn replaced wheat as the cash crop. Westmoreland Davis, who was the wet candidate, meaning he supported the sale of alcohol, was elected governor in 1917. He served from 1918 to 22. Davis grew up in Richmond, but his family lost their wealth in the Civil War. He attended Virginia Military Institute on a scholarship, but then went to Columbia Law, moved to New York City, and became quite wealthy as a lawyer. And in 1903, he and his wife Marguerite purchased Morven Park, which is the estate just north of Leesburg. He took up farming at that point. He founded the Loudon Hunt, served as a master of foxhounds, and despite his lack of agricultural experience, he purchased the Southern Planter Journal, Agricultural Journal, which he published until his death in 1942. And through that journal, he advocated for farming reforms and the use of scientific methods to improve productivity. He was, as I said, elected governor in 1917, and he oversaw the creation of the state highway system, as well as other modernizations and reforms of the state government. In 1918, Leesburg Hospital opened its building on Cornwall Street. This building, of course, is gone now, having been replaced by the hospital that is there today. Almost 600 Loudoners served in World War I, and in July of 1919, Leesburg hosted a homecoming parade for the veterans. And then in 1922, the World War I memorial on the courthouse lawn was dedicated, and this is a photo of the crowd on the courthouse lawn during that dedication. Interwar years, 1922, this building opened, not where we're now, but the original building opened as a private subscription library. There had been other libraries in Leesburg. Subscription libraries you paid to join that were established in a variety of homes, moved around a bit. But then this was the first purpose-built library building in the town. In 1925, Leesburg High School was constructed. This building, of course, still exists today. It is the Leesburg Senior Center on North Street. In 1927, Leesburg Fire Company's new station was built on Loudon Street. The building, of course, still exists. The bell's gone, but it's now Gleesville Gallery on Loudon Street. And in 1931, the Tally Ho Movie Theater opened. So, and arguably the most famous Leesburg resident of all time was General George C. Marshall. He was the U.S. Army Chief of Staff from July of 1939 through World War II until he retired in November of 1945. In the spring of 1941, he and his wife Catherine purchased the house known as Dodonna Manor here in Leesburg, and it was the only home that they owned. Previously, they had just lived in base housing through all of his posts. Following World War II, Marshall served as Special Envoy to China, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense. And in 1953, Marshall received the Nobel Peace Prize for the post-war economic recovery plan that bore his name, the Marshall Plan. And he was actually at Dodonna Manor when he received the telegram notifying him that he had been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. He remains the only soldier to receive that award. And in 1956, he spoke at the dedication of the World War II and Korean War Memorial on the Loudoun County Courthouse lawn. He was quite a good civic citizen, very involved in Leesburg. So the Civil Rights era. Oops, sorry, let me go back. So in the late 1860s, the first public school for African Americans opened in this building on Liberty Street. There had been private schools, the Bailey Institute. There had been Freedmen Bureau schools after, after the Civil War, but this was the first public school. And then in 1884, the Leesburg Training School on Union Street opened. And this was the first purpose-built, this first building built as a school for African Americans. This building does still exist. It's owned by Loudoun County. They're in the process, they've leased it to the Loudoun Freedom Centers in the process of raising money to renovate it and open it as a center for education center and with exhibits and so forth. So there's a picture of one of the classes at the Leesburg Training School. In 1930, the school building expanded to include high school classes. And in 1941, Douglas High School opened. So a group of African-American parents raised $4,000 to purchase land for a high school. The reason they were told they had approached the school board about building a high school, an accredited high school for African-American students. The training school was not accredited, and so a lot of the more well-to-do African-Americans sent their kids to DC or other places to go to high school. They had approached the school board. The school board said, well, we don't have any land to build an accredited high school for African-Americans. And so the parents raised the money, they bought the land, and that's the land on which Douglas was built. They sold it to the county for $1. And then the school board dragged their feet on building a school until they were really threatened with legal action. And so then they borrowed $30,000 from the state literary fund and constructed the school. In 1954, Loudoun County Public Schools were consolidated. Previously, it was a bunch of different schools in, Leesburg and Bluemont and the different areas of the county. In 1958, Frederick Douglass Elementary School opened. It used to be on Sicklen Road, Old Sicklen Road, sort of behind the Douglass High School. It's on the site of the current Frederick Douglass Elementary School, but it was a much smaller building. And at that point, the training school closed. And then after desegregation in 1968, when all of the schools were desegregated, the Douglass School became a middle school, and then it served as an alternative high school and as a community center. And it just recently opened following a fabulous renovation. And if you have not been in the building, I highly recommend. They've done a great job with some historic displays in that building, talking about the history of the school and the history of both segregated education and desegregation here in Loudoun County. Loudoun County School is fully desegregated. In 1933, George Crawford, a black man, was accused of murdering a Middleburg socialite and her maid, both of whom were white women. Charles Houston, who was the dean of Howard University's law school and the first general counsel of the NAACP, was brought on to lead the first all-black legal team of a major case in the South. One of the men who served on his legal team, served as a researcher on his legal team, was a student at Howard Law School at the time, and that was Thurgood Marshall, who was a future Supreme Court justice. And Thurgood Marshall was credited with saying that it was the Crawford case that led him to focus his career on civil rights. Given the overwhelming evidence of Crawford's guilt, he was guilty, Charles Houston focused on saving Crawford from the death penalty rather than trying to acquit him. And he was successful in that. Crawford was sentenced to life in prison, but that was seen as a major step forward for civil rights because it was an all-white jury. But also as part of that, Houston successfully exposed the systemic exclusion of qualified Black citizens from jury pools, which were, that was later declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. Unfortunately, Houston didn't live to see that ruling because he died of a heart attack in 1950. Several years after the Crawford case, he was the attorney that the African-American parents hired to help them convince the school board to actually build a high school on the property that they had given them. And as I said, he didn't, not only did he not live to see the declaration of biased jury pools unconstitutional, but also segregated schools were declared unconstitutional in 1954. So in 1961, Leesburg lunch counters opened to African Americans following Middleburg's. The reason Middleburg's had opened to African Americans was because there were two very famous people who visited Middleburg a lot in 1961, who they did not want to insult, and that, of course, was President Kennedy and his wife, Jacqueline. In 1963, both the Tally Ho movie theater and the Village Lanes bowling alley were integrated. They had been segregated previously. They were integrated with relatively little fanfare. African Americans made a concerted effort to just show up and demand admittance, and they were given admittance. The Leesburg Fire Company, however, owned a pool off of Loudon Street, and it was the public swimming pool for the town, and they closed the school rather than integrate it. They filled it in, paved it over rather than integrate it. And here's a photo. So this building, this is the fire station that still exists on Loudon Street, and there you can see the pool, and there was a baseball field. It's now townhouses. So in 1965, the Balch Library was integrated. It was opened originally as a private subscription library, whites only. It became part of the Loudoun County Public System, library system, and then was integrated when they integrated. In 1976, John Tolbert became the first African-American council member. He was first appointed and then later elected. And in 1992, the local I Have a Dream committee organized Loudoun's annual Martin Luther King Day March, which still takes place today on Martin Luther King Day. They go from the Loudoun County Courthouse down Market Street to the Douglas School, where they hold an event there. Leesburg Executive Airport. So in 1918, a World War I plane landed on a grassy field in Wallace George's farm just east of Leesburg. And by 1930, George's Field had become a privately run airstrip. And you can see this is a USGS map, and you can see the landing strip listed right there. In 1950, radio personality Arthur Godfrey purchased George's Field and gave it to the town on the condition that it continued to be used as an airport. He owned a house, he owned a home at what is now Beacon Hill. And he had a radio show in New York, and he flew his own plane back and forth. And so he wanted an airfield available, for him to use. And this is a picture of Mr. Godfrey with one of his planes. The town agreed. But as by 1961, as development was encroaching upon the airport, the town applied for a grant from the FAA to build a new modern airport south of town. And Godfrey allowed the town to sell George's Field, and as long as we used the funds for the new airport. And then this is a photo. This is Frank Rafflo here. This is Stanley Calkins. These are two members of the town council at the groundbreaking of the new airport. And the new Godfrey Field was dedicated in October of 1864. And officially, the Leesburg Airport is still known as the Leesburg Executive Airport at Godfrey Field in honor of Officer Godfrey. And this is a photo of the airport that a pilot took for us on approach to the airport in June about 3 years ago. So it's grown a lot. Postwar growth. In 1949, Colonial Leesburg Incorporated, a nonprofit, was established. In 1958, an additional almost 1,800 acres was annexed. This is the 1962 map of the town limits. So you can see it had grown quite a bit. Whoops. So Catoctin Circle had started to be built. The railroad was still the railroad at that time. In 1959, we adopted our first zoning ordinance. Dulles Airport opened in 62. In 1963, the Old and Historic District was established, which actually predates the establishment of the National Register of Historic Places. So this is a map. So the larger outline, of course, is Leesburg today. The shaded area is the Historic District. That's the Old and Historic District. And that green dashed line is the original plot of Leesburg as established in 1758. And so this is a close-up of the Historic District map, outline of the Historic District. We have included, this is Rock Spring Farm, has been added to it. So in 1968, the W&OD Railroad ceased operations, and the first section of the trail, converting it to a trail, opened in 1974, and the last section opened in 1988. And so the W&OD Trail runs from Alexandria out to Percival. Late 20th century changes. Market Station redevelopment began in 84. This was the industrial area of Leesburg. It was the, it was along the railroad. So there were planing mills and industrial buildings, mills and so forth. So we annexed almost 5,000 acres, more than doubling the size of Leesburg. And so this map shows all the various annexations. So the gold in the center is the original 70 acres, and then 102 acres were added. And then, so this tan area is what was added in 1984. And then there have been little bits added here and there for specific reasons. So, so for example, this area here was added for the construction of Heritage High School. And this was added for Tuscarora High School. This was added for Smarts Mill and Francis Hazel Reed schools. The town actually owns this parcel here. It's Veterans Park, which we're in the process of developing. And so there have been these small additions as we've gone along. In 1986, we received a donation of 138 acres from the Rust family for the creation of Ida Lee Park. And that led to the establishment of the creation of our Department of Parks and Recreation. In 1990, a new town hall was built. Hard to believe that it's been that long. The Greenway opened in 1995 and has really fueled the access to DC has really fueled Leesburg's growth. Also in 95, the county administration building was built. 1998, the Outlet Mall, which still claims to get 5 million visitors a year. So that brings us to the 21st century. So what's been happening since 2000? So since 2000, we've had 3 new elementary schools, 1 middle school, 2 new high schools, over 6,000 new housing units constructed, 2 million square feet of new retail space, 1 million square feet of new office space, 1.5 million square feet of other commercial space, non-residential space. It's a photo of Tuscarora High School. So there's River Point neighborhood, Crescent Place, some of these, King Street Station, Village at Leesburg, of course, has been built since 2000. So today, where are we today? So we're the largest town in Virginia, with a population of right around 50,000, depending upon who you pay attention to. The Census Bureau has us under 50,000. And in 22, we were ranked 8th out of 25 best places in the nation to live for families. So I encourage you, Laura mentioned this at the beginning, we have a virtual walking tour app. So there are 7 tours on it right now. I only have 6 listed, I'm missing one. So the Historic Highlights tour, there's an African-American tour, a women's history tour, architectural tour. As she mentioned, there is a new tour of Union Cemetery that was developed by a young man who did it as his Eagle Scout project. Highly encouraged to do that. You might want to wait till it's a little cooler though, because yeah, it's hot. But you can go to our website under visitors, go to walking tours and find that. And you don't have to download the app onto your phone. You can actually just open it in your browser on your phone and take it that way as well. So thank you very much. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to entertain questions. Yes, ma'am.
Are there any books you would recommend we could read more about?
Oh, actually, I don't have any specific, but I'm sure if you ask at the desk upstairs at the library, they would be happy to recommend some books on Leesburg. Yes, sir.
Frank Ruffalo wrote 2 books
Mhm.
that we in the Kiwanis Club years ago on August 4th days
Mhm.
would have out there. I don't know where they are.
Well, I'm sure the library has copies of them.
That would be, oh,
Right. So Frank Rafflo's books would be a good place to start.
Gene Shields' books. No, these books.
Yeah. Other questions? Yes, sir.
I'm Jack King and I'm president of the Old Stone Church Foundation. You go down here to Liberty Street, take a left and block, and there's the Old Stone Church that was up there in the in her briefing. Actually, this is beautiful. I'd like to have a copy of this. What we're trying to do with the Old Stone Church Foundation is to get folks like you to go visit. And what it is an old inactive thing. Where the Old Stone Church was part of it, it's not there. But when you go over there are people, when you go into the Old Stone Church building, can feel inspired. And I did too. Now, I'm new to this town. I've been up here since 1998, but I'm really new to the Old Stone Church. We just got elected to that foundation process. So I'm inviting you to go to that place, see it, and if you would like to know more about it, we'll be back there at the back door. I have brochures from the Old Stone Church. And I'd love to hand out one to each one of you. I didn't bring that. I got some other things. If you have a person you would like to want. The Old Stone Church property is, can't call it hallowed ground because I don't know if anybody ever did. But the early Methodist preachers, John Wesley, Francis Asbury, And others that were part of the Methodist district back then were there, and they preached there. And I don't know whether they hallowed that ground, but let's call it